You know, you guys, this is a course in biology. And I want you to do one thing for me. Before we start out, I want you to picture something in your minds. Picture scientists and picture science. What do you got in your mind? Just please don't tell me you have guys in white coats with pocket protectors and fuzzy hair standing there thinking. Because you know, my worst nightmare is my 5th grade science class. Here I go, I walk into the class, and what do I have to do? We don't do science. We start to learn procedure. We start to learn something called the scientific method. You know, and for me, and possibly for you until today, it's been so frustrating for you because all you've ever heard is the rigors of scientific method. What did you learn with the scientific method? All right, here we go. Ready? Here's what you learned. Guaranteed 5th grade science class. You learned, number 1, scientists stand around and they think. What do they think about? Well, they observe things. They look and they say, let's observe this. And then number 2, after they observe, they do this thing called hypothesis. Now, there was a word for a 5th grader, a hypothesis, an educated guess. And so we hypothesize as scientists in our white lab coats with our frizzy hair. And then after our hypothesis, we design an experiment. Well, what's that? Well, that's some kind of religious thing, I'm sure, because most people don't get what that is. And then after our experimentation, what do we do next? We gather data, and then we conclude. Now, you know, I got to tell you, there's nothing really wrong with this. In fact, this is kind of what I do with my life at times. But you know, when you formalize a procedure, when you memorize steps, you lose it. You lose what it's really all about. Science is certainly about observing and predicting and hypothesizing and doing all of those things. But even more importantly than that, science is about one very simple word. Now, before I tell you that word, I want you to look at the top of my head. You see, I'm bald. And I know you think I'm bald because I'm old. But I'm really only 28 years old. Okay, I'm old. But the baldness has to do with something I've been doing since I was about 12 years old. You know what I do? I look around at things and I go like this. I'm always wondering. You see, that's what science is about. Science is about wonder. Science is about curiosity. The single most important trait any of you as future scientists need is the trait of curiosity. You go with your curiosity and you'll be a scientist. And you know what I want to talk about today? I want to talk about one of, in my mind, the heroes of biology. A guy who was born in the 19th century who set the stage for everything we do in science today. His name was Charles Darwin. When was he born? He was born on a pretty good date for this planet. Why was it a good date? Well, it was February 12th, 1809. 2 pretty good births happened that day. Charles Darwin, who's my hero, and Abraham Lincoln, a guy who's a hero to a lot of other people too. Well, he's not in this course. We're going to do Charles Darwin today. Charles Darwin, he was kind of born, I got to admit it, with a silver spoon in his mouth. He came from a rich family. His father was a very famous doctor in England. His grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was not only a famous doctor, but he was a poet and a writer. And in fact, you know, you've already figured out that we're going towards the theory of evolution here, because that's what Charles Darwin is known for, his theory of natural selection. But you know what? He wasn't the first Darwin at all to think about natural selection. His grandfather, Erasmus, probably 70, 80, 100 years before he even thought about the theory of natural selection, said the following. Would it be too bold to imagine that in the great length of time since the earth began to exist, perhaps even millions of ages before the commencement of the history of making, would it be too bold to imagine that all the warm-blooded animals have arisen from one living filament? This guy wrote this in the 1700s, from one living filament. Now, nobody paid attention to it, for reasons you'll see in just a few minutes, but nevertheless, this is the influences that Charles Darwin grew up with. Well, let's talk a little bit about Charles. Very cool life story. 16-year, well, you know, silver spoon, had this nice little, he had a farm. He was a gentleman farmer, which meant he didn't work, but they had cows and pigs and stuff. But on the other hand, his dad wanted him to be a doctor. His dad was very concerned about his progress in school. You guys remember what it was like to be 15 and 16? Parents always seem concerned about your progress in school. But at the age of 16, Dad sent him off to medical school. You did that back in those days. There was a little bit less to learn in medical school than there is now. And Chuck thought he was going to be a doctor. And, you know, after a few days in medical school, he had to go and watch a surgery. No problem, right? Well, it turned out it was a problem. Here's what happened. He walked into the operating theater, and there laying on the operating table was a young child. Back in those days, they didn't use a lot of anesthetics, and so they started operating on this child with no ether. Charles lasted about 3 minutes. Out of the room he went, and nobody really knows what happened to him. Some say he passed out, some say he did other bodily functions, but the bottom line is he didn't make it through the surgery, and that was the end of medical school. Dad, I know you paid for me to go to medical school, but I can't go. Can you imagine going home with a story like that? I don't like watching surgery, Dad. Well, that's what he did. Dad's quote, here it comes. You care for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all of your family. Can you imagine Dad saying that to you? Probably a lot of you have been yelled at for rat catching and shooting. Well, anyway, what's the second most respectable profession in the 19th century England? Law. Off he goes to law school, flunks out of law school, can't stand it. Well, strike two, and where are we going now, Charles? And Charles was sent to divinity school to be a preacher. He felt he could handle that, and you know what? It was a fairly relaxed curriculum, and he was starting to make it slowly but surely. It looked like he was going to make it through divinity school. He hated the classics. He absolutely hated the classics. And here comes this little story we're going to come back to later. He despised math. In fact, a quote from him about math, I fear I will stick fast in the mud, and there I shall remain. You ever felt that way about calculus? I can identify with that. Okay, well, anyway, he finally, believe it or not, made it through preacher school, and he graduated and was ready to get his degree and eventually be assigned a church. Well, what happened next is very, very interesting. While he was at divinity school, he had met up with one of the professors, a guy by the name of Henslow, and became a tight buddy with Henslow, and Henslow was a naturalist. He and Henslow used to go for walks together, geologizing, finding bugs, hunting, a true naturalist life. Well, after Darwin graduated from divinity school, he took the summer and he went off geologizing, and he came back, and there in his mailbox was a letter from Henslow. Interestingly enough, Henslow was offered a job. You see, there was this ship, and the ship was going to be sailing around the world. The ship was going to be called, well, it was called the Beagle. Now, the Beagle, this was going to be its second voyage, was going to be captained by a man of 23 years, Robert Fitzroy. He was a very, very accomplished seaman, but young, not much younger than Darwin. Now, Henslow was offered a job to be the naturalist on the ship. The ship was going to sail from England down to the Cape Verde Islands. It was going to go all around the coast of South America, eventually rounding the tip of South America, crossing the Pacific Ocean to Australia, back to the bottom of Africa, back to England, or back to South America and up to England. It was going to be a voyage of 5 years. Mrs. Henslow did not like the idea of Mr. Henslow going away for 5 years. Can you imagine that? Wow, Charles Darwin said, Dad, this is it. Look it, I got a job. He's offered me a job. And Dad, needless to say, was not very happy about this. Why? Still another job change? I just sent you to divinity school? Now you're going to go cruising? What's the pay on this thing? Well, Dad, pardon me? Well, I have to pay for my own room and board. Now, put yourself in Charles's place. Hi, Dad, I have a job. I have to pay for it. What do you think Dad said? Well, he said something like this. He said, if you can find one sane man in all of England to tell me to let you do this, then I will let you do this. But forget it. No one's going to say you can. Well, Charles ran out and went all over the place asking uncles and cousins and this and that. What do you think? What do you think? And they all thought he was crazy. But along came Uncle Josiah. Uncle Josiah Wedgwood. You ever heard of Wedgwood? Uncle Josiah was a fairly rich guy. And you know, he was his mom's brother. And so he went to Uncle Josiah and he said, yo, Uncle Josiah, don't you think I should do this? And he, being just a little bit on the edge himself, said, absolutely. Send the boy. He had to stay by his word and go with his brother-in-law's advice. And so he sent him. Or he said, you could apply for the job. And now we come to the most ironic and interesting thing of the whole first part of this story. On September 5th in 1831, Charles Darwin was interviewed. And he was interviewed by Fitzroy, the captain of the ship. I got to tell you, this is like one of the most ironic things in history. Now, Fitzroy, like I said, was an accomplished seaman. And you know, I mean, he was one of the top sailors, and this was a major job that he was given, to sail Her Majesty's ship, the Beagle. But Fitzroy felt that he had another agenda. Fitzroy felt that he had been given divine guidance. Now, I got to go back just a little bit and tell you something that was going on in England and all of Europe at that time. And in our second lesson, we're going to go closer and in a lot more detail about this. There was this newfangled biology stuff happening back then in the 1800s. And there were this radical group of biologists that were proposing this theory that battled the theory of creationism. And it was this crazy theory called evolution. Fitzroy felt that it was his job to go out and once and for all prove the literal story of the Bible. He was going to prove that the story of creation was indeed the truth, and that these crazies with their theory of evolution were way out there. And there, sitting in front of Fitzroy, was the perfect candidate. A young man, 22 years old. He was a naturalist, and he had just graduated from divinity school. Sometimes things work in very mysterious ways.